Hi, we're raising questions again. We have hundreds of people here in the Channel 8 auditorium, and we're going to talk about whether or not we are headed for disaster. And the reason why that question popped up so interestingly this week was that there's a book out that apparently Mr. Bannon of the White House is devoted to. And Mr. Bannon, of course, is one of the chief assistants of the president. And people are talking about this book and about whether or not we're headed for disaster because there are cycles in American history, says the book, that are leading us that way. So let's take a look. It is a really, really difficult question to answer. And the first question is, are there indeed cycles in politics and in history? I have notes, and that's what I'm looking at. Yes, indeed. There are financial, for instance, financial and political cycles. Things go up and down, in other words, in finance. We all know that. There was a depression in the 1920s and 30s. There was a very big, fat depression, and then we bounced back. And there are political cycles, too, so you get conservatives and liberals and this, that, and the other thing. And you also get other kinds of cycles, but these are probably at least two of the very biggest, let's put it that way. And in America, this is the really interesting thing. In America, there's also a cycle of, or at least a lot of people say there's a cycle of religiosity or religion in politics, you might say. And then there's a countervailing cycle that has to do more with an emphasis on money and capitalism and people making it big through finance and so forth and so on. So these two strands really do have a role in American politics and in American life. Religion and finance, and an emphasis, in other words, on, you might call it, an emphasis on God, or an emphasis on money, let's put it that way. And the whole idea here is that these cycles run through American history, an overt emphasis on money or an overt emphasis on religion, God, and so forth and so on, and they mix together and they produce big fat changes. And the whole question is about that book that I mentioned, which is called The Fourth Turning. There is a book out called The Fourth Turning, which concentrates on cycles like these and asks the question, are we headed for a disaster real soon that will produce something good? So there might be a disaster that produces something good. That's the whole idea. And this is a hot idea in the White House and in politics right now. So that's a legitimate question. Are there cycles? Yes, there are. And are we headed for disaster? And I'm not sure we're going to be able to answer that, but one thing we can point out is the relationship between domestic politics and international politics based on some of these cycles. And we can get to a question that's really interesting with regard to disasters. We all know that the president launched missiles against a site in Syria very recently, and a lot of people are worried. Now, what's that going to have as far as effects are concerned on international relations in the nuclear age? Are we headed for disaster of that type? Was it a good idea to launch those missiles into Syria? Was it a good idea, and why did that happen? I have a somewhat unique attitude towards it, and I'd like to answer the question as well as I can. In the first place, there are many, many schisms in America. Bear with me on this. This is actually related to what we've said so far. There are a lot of divisions in the United States. I'm looking for the eraser. We have found the eraser. And there are a lot of divisions in America that are founded on various kinds of factors. One of them is, of course, race. The white people, the so-called white people in America, used to be very, very dominant up until recently. And then came the Civil Rights Revolution, giving blacks more of their rights. And we now also have a hefty section of Hispanics, Asians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And not all the thinking that is done by all these Americans is the same. This is a really important thing with regard to cycles and missiles, believe it or not. In the 50s, along came a guy, this is an example of the schisms, along came a guy named, yes, Elvis Presley, who combined a lot of appeal based on black music with also other elements that you might call white music or hillbilly music or whatever it was. I'm no expert on that. But he combined in rock and roll a lot of elements that were related to black ethnicity. And this caused a revolution in music and a lot of anger among white people, believe it or not. Elvis Presley, a very tame guy really, was on the Ed Sullivan Show, a very popular variety show, Sunday night. Early in his career, he was a phenomenon, and the camera was not allowed to show him below the waist because he moved below the waist. Imagine, what an absolute scandal. Nowadays, if you're not moving below the waist, you're not on stage. But when this happened, when Elvis Presley came along, it illustrated beautifully that whites and blacks largely thought differently. And there were whites, of course, who absolutely loved all of this, and their parents, on the other hand, did not like it much at all. So all of these schisms are happening in America and have gone on for a very, very long time. So there is, what results from that is that people start to argue in America more than in other countries. They start to argue about morals. And the people who established America, let's call them P for Puritans, were very, very big on certain morals. There's that religious curve. The religious curve was very high when the Puritans were in charge of the places that they were in charge of at that time, hundreds of years ago. And then after the initial Puritan conquest, you might call it, or the initial settlers' conquest of the United States, there were a lot of people around who weren't just interested in religion and freedom of religion. They were also interested in lots of money, making money. So America had these two strands right away that we've already looked at. The money-making idea and also the religious idea. So these two strands have opposed each other to a large extent. And then, as we just said, there are also racial and other divisions in America. And this gets us into a situation where what we're looking for is, in these times especially, a leader, somebody who can tell us, in other words, well, what are we? Are we a religious country or are we just a dollar country? What kind of country are we? What are the goals that we ought to be pursuing? And how can we make people feel good about pursuing something moral and religious or something more oriented towards making money? Now, if there's a breakdown, this is half the answer to the question, are we headed towards disaster? If there's a breakdown here and not enough people can agree on what's moral, or what's religious, or what's the proper attitude towards money, then the whole society tends to collapse. And it's really, really fascinating that what happened was that we just had a recent election, and somebody was elected, amazingly enough, from the world of money, Mr. Trump, obviously from the world of money. And he was also elected, not just because of his obvious fluency in how to make money, but also because there are these schisms here between various ethnic groups and also inside of ethnic groups. There are different classes in each ethnic group, for instance, and they need some direction. People on the bottom or near the bottom are very jealous of the 1%, for instance. Mr. President, what are we supposed to do? Electing a man from the world of money looked like a good solution. Well, it turns out, in my opinion at least, that his real function is to tell us about morals, not how to make money, but how we should be living on the moral plane. That's the really American idea. We're coming to the end here. We're finally answering the question whether or not we're headed for disaster. And the answer is nobody knows. The whole point of a presidency really is to have somebody in power who can tell us what is the proper moral outlook. Now, a lot of people will say, no, that's mixing religion and politics, and we have a wall of separation in America between church and state. That phrase is nowhere near the Constitution. We don't have a wall of separation between church and state. Actually, between church and state, there's great cooperation. If there's a fire that threatens to destroy a church, does the fire department go to rescue that church? Yes, obviously. Are there church schools that get public money, tax money? Yes, obviously. There is no wall of separation between church and state. And also, there's no wall of separation in the American mind between religion or morals and the more practical aspects of life, like making money, making a living, how to live, and so forth. These are very, very closely related. So why did we get missiles? Why did we get missiles launched into Syria? It's because in the international scene, or on the international scene, there is no recognized moral authority. The UN was set up in 1945 to be that authority. And as we all know, it isn't. It doesn't work. The UN can't step in and act as a kind of supervisor of the moral order or the international order at all. Why? Because it's made up of individual countries. And the countries that make it up have not given the UN the power to lord it over the countries. No country, as far as I know, has done what the UN was first designed to do. Believe it or not, the UN was designed to have an army, all of its own. And the UN would more or less supervise the international order. That hasn't happened. Well, the international order is based on moral ideas, peace, that kind of thing, unity, that kind of thing. And by launching missiles into Syria, I think what happened was that Mr. Trump was telling the Syrians, you broke the rules. Yes, I understand war is bad, war is very, very tough, but there are rules that you will not break. And this has given some impetus, maybe throughout the whole world, to the idea that indeed there are moral rules, even in war. And if that's true, if that is an impetus that's starting to burgeon somewhat, even in America, then we're going to get more and more of the idea that the president is there to enforce a moral order, not just around the world, but why not here, in the States, in this country? And if he gets away from being seen as a capitalist and a man who has capitalist-type solutions to the country's ills, then he can move more into the religious or moral sphere and start enforcing rules, obviously not launching missiles inside of America, but start enforcing rules that will enforce a different moral order in the country and that will get this country away from the more or less every man or woman for themselves idea and get us away from a division into 1% and then the rest of us. So by launching missiles, this country, and maybe this president, showed there are rules and they count, even in war. Why not in peace? Why not in the economic war that takes place on a daily basis in this country more and more? So who knows? Back to those cycles, it's very, very interesting, I think, to maybe predict that the cycle that we're in may look very, very financial. We got a dollar-oriented president elected. And then on the other hand, the other part of those cycles that I've been talking about, the godly cycle, the religious cycle, may actually emerge out of this, and we may be in a phase where the president, not necessarily President T, not necessarily him, but somebody right after him is going to enforce with glee better religious and moral ideas in order to teach the country, and maybe even the rest of the world, that there are indeed rules that you shouldn't break. And maybe one of those rules will be some of the rules in the United States Constitution. The chief one there being, what was the Constitution about? The phrase is, the founders wanted to make a more perfect union, a more perfect union, not a place where there are separate races, separate ideas about morals and how to live and so forth that conflict too much with each other, not a place where there's moneyed people against people without money, but a place instead where there is unity. What a paradox if these missiles launched into Syria start people thinking about a higher moral order. What would we get? We might be able to avoid the disaster that other people are predicting.